The map tore. Not all the way through, but enough. The sound of it ripping at the fold was like a gunshot in the dead silence of the Dusty Creek surveyor's office, and every man in the room turned to look at Letitia Ralston as she stood there with the fragile parchment trembling in her hands, her knuckles white around the edges, her jaw locked so tight it could have cracked stone. "I'm telling you, miss," said the land clerk, a round, sweating man with ink-stained fingers and the moral backbone of a wet newspaper, "that map is not a legal surveying document. It ain't registered. It ain't certified. And even if it was, a woman ain't got the authority under this territory's statutes to file a cartographic claim on unverified land coordinates. That's just the law." Letitia did not blink. She held the torn edge of her father's map together with the precision of a surgeon and the stillness of someone who had decided, somewhere on the long road from Missouri to New Mexico territory, that she was going to stop being polite about things that mattered. "My father, Professor Gideon Ralston, spent 11 years surveying the Sangre de Cristo corridor," she said, her voice so low, and controlled it forced every man in the room to lean slightly forward. "He used a theodolite, a prismatic compass, and triangulation methods he personally adapted from the British Ordnance Survey. He died with 9 of the 11 primary survey points completed. I intend to finish the remaining 2. And when I do, this map becomes legally sufficient for filing. I have read the Territorial Surveying Act of 1872 in its entirety, and nothing in it prohibits a woman from completing a survey begun by a licensed cartographer, especially when that woman is his only trained apprentice." The clerk opened his mouth. Letitia laid the map on his desk, flat and deliberate, and placed her father's surveying license beside it. "I would like a receipt for these documents," she said. "You will have them back in 30 days. It was at that precise moment that Benjamin Easton walked in. He was tall enough that he had to angle his hat through the doorway, and he moved the way men move when they have spent years in wide open country and have forgotten that buildings have walls. He was somewhere in his early 30s, dark-haired, with the kind of jaw that suggested it had broken a few knuckles on its way to its current shape, and he wore a deputy marshal's badge on a canvas vest that had clearly seen every kind of weather the territory could produce. He stopped when he saw the scene in front of him, read it fast the way men who have survived dangerous country learn to read rooms, and then his eyes landed on the map. He went very still. "Gideon Ralston's map," he said. It was not a question. Letitia turned to look at him. "You knew my father. He saved my life," said Benjamin Easton. "In the summer of 1878, in a box canyon east of the Jicarilla Range. He knew the land well enough to find the one exit I would have missed and died in." He paused. "I heard he passed. I'm sorry for your loss, Miss Ralston." The sincerity in his voice was so plain and unornamented that it cut through every wall she had spent the last 4 months building. She swallowed once. "Then perhaps," she said carefully, "you might understand why I intend to finish what he started." Benjamin Easton looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the clerk, and something in his expression made the man take a small step backward. "Give the lady her receipt," said Benjamin. "She's within her legal rights, and you know it." That was how it began, not with tenderness, not with the soft machinery of ordinary romance. It began with a torn map, a bureaucratic wall, and 2 people who had both, in their own separate ways, been shaped by the same stretch of dangerous, beautiful, uncharted land. Letitia Ralston was 26 years old in the autumn of 1880, and she had been her father's apprentice surveyor since the age of 14, when most girls her age were learning to embroider, and she was learning to read a topographical grade. Gideon Ralston had been a cartographer of some renown, a man who believed that the most important thing you could do in a new country was understand it honestly, to measure it with your eyes open and your instruments level, and your assumptions set aside. He had raised his daughter the same way. Her mother had died when Letitia was 9, a winter fever that took her quietly, and after that it was just the 2 of them, moving from survey to survey across the territories, living sometimes in tents and sometimes in boarding houses, and occasionally, during the hard years, in the wagon itself. Letitia learned to drive a team before she learned long division. She learned to triangulate a position before she learned to waltz. She could calculate azimuth angles in her head while holding a compass in a crosswind, and she could do it faster and more accurately than most trained surveyors she had ever met. A fact she had learned to share carefully, because men who were shown up by a woman in their professional domain tended to become obstacles, and Letitia had learned that obstacles cost time, and time was always the scarcest thing on a frontier survey. When her father died in the spring of 1880, a sudden heart seizure in their camp outside of Santa Fe, Letitia had been alone with him. She had held his hand and memorized everything he said in his final hours, which was mostly about the map. About the 2 remaining survey points in the high country north of the Mora River Valley. About how important it was that the land be properly documented before the railroad companies sent their own surveyors, who would measure it in whatever way best served the railroad's interests rather than the truth. "Finish it, Letitia," he had told her. "You know the method better than anyone I have ever taught. The land deserves to be known honestly." She had buried him outside Santa Fe and spent 2 weeks settling his affairs, and then she had packed his instruments, his journals, his theodolite, his prismatic compass, his field notebooks, and his unfinished map, and she had driven the wagon northeast toward Dusty Creek, which was the nearest town with a territorial surveying office, and according to her father's notes, the logical staging point for the final 2 survey legs. She had not anticipated the clerk. But she was not surprised by him either. She had anticipated needing help, though, and not the romantic kind. She needed a guide. Someone who knew the high country north of Mora well enough to navigate it safely. Someone who understood the kind of terrain that had taken her father 11 years to partially map. Someone who was not going to spend the entire expedition explaining to her why women were not suited for cartographic fieldwork. She had not anticipated Benjamin Easton. He was waiting for her outside the surveying office when she came out, the receipt folded in her coat pocket, and the map rolled and tucked safely under her arm in its oilskin sleeve. The October sky above Dusty Creek was the kind of blue that happens in high desert country in autumn, so deep and clear it almost ached to look at, and the wind carried the smell of pinon smoke from the cook fires on the east end of town. "I know the Mora country," said Benjamin without preamble. Letitia stopped walking. She looked at him. He was standing with his arms crossed and one shoulder against the hitching post, and he had the relaxed posture of a man who was accustomed to waiting but also to acting, a combination that was rarer than it sounded. "Why would you offer that?" she asked. "Because I knew your father. And because those 2 remaining survey points are in some of the most technically difficult terrain in the territory. And because," he added, with a directness she respected even as it annoyed her slightly, "you're going to need someone who can handle trouble, and trouble is a near certainty up there right now." "What kind of trouble?" "The Consolidated Territorial Land Company. You may have heard of them." She had. Everyone west of the Missouri had heard of the Consolidated Territorial Land Company, or the CTLC, as they were more commonly known in tones ranging from frustrated to genuinely terrified. They were a Denver-based concern with railroad connections and legal firepower, and a well-documented history of acquiring land through methods that technically stopped just short of what could be proven in court. They had been working the Mora Valley for the better part of 2 years, and there were persistent rumors that their own survey teams had been in the high country, establishing coordinates that might or might not match the actual topography, depending on which version of the topography best served the company's acquisition interests. "My father mentioned them in his journals," said Letitia carefully. "Your father was specifically warned off the high country by one of their agents last spring," said Benjamin. "I know because I was the one who took the statement. I'm a deputy marshal, Miss Ralston. I know what the CTLC is doing up there, and I know that a legitimate, properly completed survey by a licensed cartographer's apprentice, using academically sound methods, would create a legal document that directly contradicts the coordinates they have been quietly registering with the territorial office for the past 18 months. Letitia was quiet for a moment. The wind moved her dark hair across her face, and she pushed it back with a businesslike hand. "So you are not offering to help me out of sentiment," she said. "I am offering to help you out of sentiment and professional interest," said Benjamin honestly. "Both things are true at once." She looked at him for a long moment. He met her gaze without flinching, which was unusual. Most men, when she looked at them that directly, found somewhere else to look. "I set my own survey points," she said. "I calibrate my own instruments. I make my own calculations. You carry equipment when asked and handle the security situation. That is the arrangement." "Agreed," said Benjamin. "We leave at first light day after tomorrow. I need a day to re-inventory the instruments and resupply. I'll have the horses ready." He tipped his hat. It was not a condescending gesture. It was, she decided, a gesture of genuine acknowledgement, the kind a man makes when he recognizes that he is dealing with someone who knows exactly what they are doing. She walked back to her boarding house with the map under her arm, and for the first time in 4 months, something loosened in her chest. Not all the way, but enough. The morning they departed Dusty Creek was cold and crystalline, the kind of morning that makes every edge in the landscape sharp and definitive. Letitia was up 2 hours before Benjamin, which was something she expected, and she was mildly surprised to find him at the livery stable when she arrived at 4:30 in the morning, already tending to both horses with the quiet competence of a man who had done the same thing 10,000 times. He had secured a strong bay for himself and a sure-footed roan mare for her, and he had packed the supplies in a way that distributed the weight logically across both animals and the mule he had brought for the equipment. She examined his packing and did not find fault with it, which she noted internally with something approaching approval. She had her father's theodolite in its mahogany and brass case, his field notebooks, the prismatic compass, a collection of surveying rods she had assembled herself, a chain for distance measurement, her own set of mathematical tables, and the map itself in its protective oilskin. She also had her own rifle, a Winchester Model 1873 that she had been shooting since she was 16, and a small Colt revolver that had belonged to her father and that she wore in a leather holster at her hip with the same unceremonious practicality with which she wore everything else. Benjamin looked at the revolver but did not comment. She appreciated that. They rode north out of Dusty Creek as the first light began to separate the sky from the mountains, and for a while neither of them spoke, which Letitia found comfortable rather than awkward. She had grown up in the kind of sustained silences that fieldwork creates, long stretches of careful observation and internal calculation that don't require or benefit from conversation. The country north of Dusty Creek was high desert, transitioning gradually into pinyon-juniper woodland as the elevation climbed, and then into ponderosa pine as they gained the first significant ridges. By mid-morning they had left the last evidence of settled country behind and were moving through a landscape that was, in Letitia's professional assessment, exceptionally beautiful and exceptionally unforgiving. "Tell me about the CTLC surveyors," she said, as they rode through a section of open parkland between pine stands. "What methods are they using?" Benjamin considered this. "Mostly they are using a single transit setup at each point, which keeps their time short and their footprint small. Their men are competent but fast. They are not doing the kind of cross-verification your father used." "No," said Letitia, "they wouldn't be. A single transit reading without angular cross-verification can be off by significant margins in broken terrain, which is exactly the kind of error that would look legitimate on paper, but would serve very specific interests when translated to a legal land description." "You're saying they're creating intentional error?" I am saying that if I were a company with a strong interest in certain land coordinates reading a certain way, and I employed surveyors who were not required to cross-verify their readings, the resulting data would very conveniently support my interest without anyone being able to prove that anything was deliberately falsified. She paused. It is elegant in a corrupt sort of way. Benjamin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Your father figured that out." He did. He wrote about it in his last journal. He had identified 3 specific points in the high country where the CTLC's coordinates diverged from what his own measurements indicated by margins that could not be attributed to instrument error or methodological variation. The divergences were consistent with a systematic bias of approximately 40 chains east in each case. And 40 chains east means what on the ground? It means that the land they have legally described as belonging to certain private parties who happen to be associated with the CTLC is actually the land currently inhabited by 7 homesteader families in the Mora Valley who settled it in good faith under the Homestead Act of 1862. A completed, cross-verified survey using proper methods would establish that those families are on the land they legally claimed and that the CTLC's descriptions are inaccurate. Benjamin stopped his horse. Letitia stopped hers and looked at him. His expression was something she couldn't quite read. 7 families, he said. 7 that I know of from my father's notes. There may be more affected. He was quiet for a long moment. The wind moved through the pines above them with a sound like rushing water. Then he said, "Then we had better make sure this survey is completed correctly." "That is precisely my intention," said Letitia, and they rode on. They made camp that first night in a sheltered draw where a spring ran cold and clear between limestone ledges. Benjamin gathered wood and built a fire with the efficiency of long practice, while Letitia set up her father's field desk, a collapsible mahogany affair that she had reinforced with copper fittings of her own design, and spread the map out with careful hands. She worked by firelight, checking her calculations for the approach to the first remaining survey point, which her father had marked on the map as P10 and located in his notes as being on a specific ridgeline northeast of the Guadalupita drainage. She was working through the azimuth calculations for their approach when she became aware that Benjamin had stopped moving on his side of the fire and was watching her. She did not look up. "The fire needs more wood," she said. "Right," he said, and she heard him move to get it. When he came back and added the wood and the fire built up, she glanced over and caught him looking at the map with an expression she recognized. It was the expression of someone who had spent time in this country and was trying to reconcile the landscape they knew with the abstraction of its representation. "Do you read maps?" she asked. "I can follow one," he said. "I wouldn't say I can read one the way you do." "What do you mean?" He sat back on his heels and looked at her. "You look at it like it's alive, like you're having a conversation with it." Letitia looked at the map for a moment. "My father used to say that a map is a letter written to someone who hasn't visited yet. All the decisions a surveyor makes about what to include and how to represent it, those are the sentences. A good map tells you the truth about a place. A bad map tells you what someone wanted you to believe about it. And your father's maps were honest," she said simply. They were quiet for a while. The fire crackled. Somewhere above them a nighthawk called. "How did he teach you?" asked Benjamin. "Your father. How does a man teach a girl to do what you do?" "The same way you teach anyone," said Letitia. "He started with the simplest concepts and built on them. And when I mastered one thing, he gave me something harder. And he never once suggested that there was anything about the work that was beyond my reach because of my sex." She paused. "He also never suggested that I should be grateful for that, which was its own kind of gift. He simply assumed I was capable and treated me accordingly. He sounds like a remarkable man." "He was," she said, and then more quietly, "he was also my whole world. So finishing this map is not only a matter of professional obligation or justice for those homesteader families. It is also the last thing he asked me to do, and I intend to do it well because there is no one alive who wants to know that it was done well more than I want to know it myself." Benjamin did not say anything, but he looked at her with the kind of attention that meant he had heard her, genuinely heard her, and had not reduced what she said to sentiment. That night, lying in her bedroll looking up at a sky that was so thick with stars it seemed almost improbable, Letitia allowed herself to think about him. Just briefly and analytically, the way she thought about most things. He was competent, clearly. He was honest, apparently. He had known her father, which created a connection she had not expected to feel. And he had intervened at the surveying office without being asked, but also without assuming authority that wasn't his, which was a distinction that mattered to her considerably. She was aware that he was also, in the most factual and unromantic sense, a very striking presence. There was something about the way he occupied physical space, with ease but without assertion, that she found herself noticing in the same involuntary way she noticed well-crafted instruments. He had good hands. She had noticed that right away. Broad, careful, competent hands. She closed her eyes and returned her thoughts to the math. The math was reliable. The first survey point, P10, was a day and a half of hard riding from their first camp, and they reached the approach to it on the afternoon of the second day. The terrain had grown progressively rougher as they climbed, and Letitia could see why this section of the survey had taken her father's longest individual leg. The ridgeline in question was heavily broken, deeply cut by arroyos, and offered very few flat surfaces suitable for instrument setup. He noted 4 possible instrument stations for this point, she said, studying the map and the landscape simultaneously in the way she had learned to do, holding both pictures in her mind and rotating one against the other. From the approach angle and the sight lines he would have needed, I believe he used the secondary ledge on the eastern face. You can see it from here. Benjamin squinted at the ridge, the one with the lightning-split ponderosa at the south end. Yes, the angle to the next point on the chain is consistent with a setup there. That's a serious climb with the equipment. Yes, said Letitia, it is. She began preparing the theodolite for transport, disassembling it precisely to its most packable configuration while maintaining the alignment of the leveling screws, and she was doing this with practiced efficiency when she heard Benjamin exhale. She looked up. He was watching her hands. "You've done that 10,000 times, he said. "At least," she confirmed and continued working. The climb to the instrument station was exactly as serious as advertised. The face of the ridge was loose in places, solid granite in others, and several of the approaches that looked promising from below turned out to be impassable with the equipment case. Letitia assessed each one quickly and redirected them without hesitation or apparent frustration, which Benjamin followed without comment, and eventually they found the route, a narrow shelf that wound up the eastern face with enough footing for careful human feet and not much else. She went first, passing the equipment up behind her in stages, and Benjamin handed each piece up and then climbed after, and they made it to the ledge in just over an hour. The view from the ledge was extraordinary. The Mora Valley spread out below them to the southwest, a long green fold in the high country, and to the northeast the peaks of the Sangre de Cristo range stood in their autumn colors against the deep sky. Letitia did not allow herself to look at it for long. She was already setting up the theodolite, leveling it with care, checking the bubble 3 times and then once more before she was satisfied. "What can I do?" asked Benjamin. "Stand there," she said, pointing to a spot 15 feet away. "Don't talk while I'm reading." He moved to the indicated spot and stood with his arms loose at his sides and said nothing, and she spent the next 45 minutes taking readings. She read the horizontal angles to 4 visible reference points, reread each one twice to confirm, recorded every reading in the field notebook in her father's system, which she had been using since she was a child, and then set up the prismatic compass for magnetic verification. She was running the calculations in her field notebook when Benjamin, who had been watching the valley below with a stillness she was beginning to recognize as characteristic of him, said quietly, "We have company." She did not look up. What kind? 3 riders coming up the south draw, moving like they know where they're going. CTLC. I wouldn't bet against it, she kept writing. She had one calculation remaining and she was not going to lose it. How long do we have? 20 minutes, maybe less, she wrote faster. The numbers came with the clarity that always arrived when there was no alternative to clarity, when the situation required her to be exactly as good as she was and no more time was available to be better. She finished the column, checked the final figure, noted it, and closed the notebook. "Done," she said. "Help me break this down." They had the theodolite disassembled and secured in its case, and everything packed and moved to the far side of the ledge in 12 minutes. Letitia was not breathing hard, but it was close. The 3 riders came up onto the ledge by a different route than the one they had used, which suggested they knew the terrain, and they were what Letitia expected. Hard-faced men on good horses, with the particular quality of stillness that people who are employed for intimidation cultivate as a professional tool. The one in the lead was heavy-set, with a broad, jowled face under a good hat and the kind of tailored canvas coat that said he was not the usual hired muscle but someone with organizational authority. "Miss Ralston," he said, "my name is Harlan Foss. I represent the Consolidated Territorial Land Company." "I know who you represent," said Letitia. "Then you'll understand that I am here as a courtesy, to let you know that this ridgeline and the surrounding terrain has been legally surveyed and recorded as part of a land grant that is currently under CTLC's management and development interest. Any additional survey work being done here without the company's consent could be considered trespassing." "Any additional survey work," said Letitia, "conducted by a party with proper territorial authorization, such as the completion of a survey begun under a valid cartographer's license, is protected activity under territorial statute. And this ridgeline specifically is not within any legal land grant that has been registered with the Territorial Office as of 3 days ago, when I personally reviewed the public record. I have the documentation." Foss's expression did not change exactly, but something around his eyes tightened. "Your father reviewed the public record too," he said, "right up until he decided the mountains were too dangerous for an old man." The air on the ledge went very still. Letitia looked at Foss for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was completely steady. "Are you implying that my father's death was not natural?" "I'm implying that this country is dangerous and that experienced men have made poor decisions in it. I'm suggesting you be careful." Benjamin stepped forward. He had not spoken until this moment, and the movement was economical and deliberate in the way that made the nature of the situation immediately clear to all 3 riders. "Harlan Foss," he said, "I am Deputy Marshal Benjamin Easton. I am personally conducting a security assessment of this survey operation, which has full legal authorization. If you have a legal objection to file, you may file it with the territorial court. If you are here to threaten or impede, that is a federal matter, and I will be making a record of this conversation and every individual present. What would you like to do?" The 3 men looked at Benjamin. Benjamin looked at them. The wind moved. Foss touched his hat brim, the gesture of a man who is retreating without admitting to retreating. "Good afternoon," he said, and they rode away down the south draw. When they were gone and the sound of hoofbeats had dissolved into the wind, Letitia carefully removed the field notebook from her coat pocket and wrote down the name, time, and every word Harlan Foss had said. "That reference to my father," she said, without looking up. "I heard it," said Benjamin. "I wrote it down too." She looked up then. He was standing with his own small notebook open. Something moved in her chest. "There will be more of them," she said. "Almost certainly," said Benjamin. "Then we should move to the second point before they can regroup." He nodded and picked up 2 of the equipment cases without being asked, and they started down the far side of the ridge. That night they camped in the open, in a meadow below the tree line where they could see in all directions, and they took turns keeping watch. When it was Letitia's watch, from midnight to 3 in the morning, she sat with the Winchester across her knees and the map in her lap and thought about Harlan Foss's comment about her father. She had asked the doctor in Santa Fe about the heart seizure. He had said it was consistent with overexertion in a man of her father's age and physical condition. But her father had been healthy, vigorous, even. He hiked mountain terrain regularly and had the constitution of a man 20 years younger. She had accepted the doctor's assessment because she had been grieving and exhausted and had no alternative framework. But Foss's words had opened a question that she was not sure she wanted to pursue and was also not sure she could choose not to. She was still sitting with this when Benjamin came to relieve her at 3 o'clock, and he read something in her face before she could settle it into its usual composure. "What are you thinking?" he asked. She told him. She was not sure why. Perhaps because it was 3 in the morning and the sky was very large and the mountains were very silent, and there was something about the quality of his attention that made it feel possible to speak things she had kept private. He sat down beside her, not too close, with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely linked, and he listened to everything she said. Then he said, "I investigated your father's death briefly after I heard about it. The circumstances were thin. A single witness, his camp helper, a boy from Santa Fe who moved on right after and whose whereabouts I haven't been able to establish since. I didn't have enough to open a formal investigation, but I didn't close the file either." Letitia absorbed this. "You were already looking into it." "I was concerned," he said simply. "Is that also why you offered to help me, not just for the legal interest or for my father's memory, but because you thought I might be in danger?" He looked at her steadily. "All of those things are true. I don't think I can separate them into a clean order of priority." She considered this for a moment. "I appreciate that you told me. I thought you deserved to know." He took the watch and she went to her bedroll, and she lay there for a while thinking that Benjamin Easton was a more complicated man than he appeared to be, which was itself more complicated than she had expected, and the thought of him sat in her chest in a way that was not entirely comfortable and also not unpleasant. 2 days later, they found the 11th and final survey point. It was not where her father's notes suggested it would be, and for the first time on the journey, Letitia encountered something that stopped her. Not permanently, but enough. The ridgeline that was supposed to contain point P11 had been altered, not by nature. A section of the natural rock face had been cut, clearly by human hands and relatively recently, removing the distinctive formation that her father had used as a reference landmark in his notes. It was not a large alteration, a few tons of rock, but it was exactly the right alteration to obscure the location of the survey point to anyone working from her father's notes alone. She stood at the edge of the cut rock and looked at it for a long time. "They knew which formation he used," said Benjamin, examining the cut edges with careful hands. "They read his field notes," said Letitia. "Or they had someone who did. Someone who understood enough about surveying method to know what to remove." "Can you still find the point?" She turned and looked at the landscape. She had her compass. She had the previous 10 survey points, all with their confirmed coordinates. She had the mathematical tables. She had her father's method, which she had practiced for 12 years. "Yes," she said. "The rock is gone, but the geometry isn't. Give me a few hours." "Take what you need," said Benjamin. She spent the next 3 hours working through a process of mathematical back calculation, using the known positions of the previous 9 confirmed points, combined with the topographical features that were too large and permanent to have been altered, the ridge profiles, the valley bearings, the peak angles to the major summits, to derive the location of the 11th point through pure geometric inference. It was the most technically demanding thing she had ever done in the field, and she was aware, at some level beneath the concentration, that Benjamin was watching her, and that the quality of his watching had changed. When she arrived at her calculated position, she set up the theodolite and took readings. She cross-verified from 3 different approach angles. The numbers confirmed each other with a consistency that made her close her eyes for just a moment in something that was mostly relief and partly an emotion she didn't have a word for. "It's here," she said. Benjamin walked over and looked at the notebook in her hand. He was close enough that she could see the exact expression on his face, and what she saw there was something she had rarely encountered from a man in a professional context. It was not condescension, and it was not patronizing approval. It was genuine, unguarded astonishment. "You calculated the position from the other points," he said slowly, "without the landmark, from the math alone. From geometry and the known coordinates, yes. It is a standard technique in cases where physical reference points are lost or degraded, though it is technically demanding because the error margins compound with each calculation step. I had to be very precise." He looked at her for a long moment. "Letitia," he said, and it was the first time he had used her name without the formal address. "That is one of the most impressive things I have ever seen anyone do." She felt her face go warm, which she found mildly inconvenient. "It is not impressive. It is mathematics." "It is absolutely both," said Benjamin. She turned back to the theodolite before he could see the warmth reach her expression in its full extent. She took the final readings over the next 2 hours, moving with a care that matched the weight of the occasion. These were the readings her father had not lived to take. These numbers, written in her own hand but in his notation system, in his field notebook, with his instruments on the land he had spent 11 years learning, were the completion of something that mattered more than she could articulate without her voice becoming unreliable. She finished the last entry. She closed the notebook. She held it in both hands for a moment. Then she sat down on a flat rock and allowed herself to feel briefly and completely how much she missed him. Benjamin sat beside her. He did not speak. He did not try to fill the silence or redirect the moment. He simply sat there in the particular quality of stillness she had come to understand was how he showed respect, and she was more grateful for it than she could say. After a while she said, "He would have been very pleased with this view. What would he have said about it?" She thought for a moment. A small, real smile arrived at the corner of her mouth. "He would have spent 15 minutes describing the geological processes that produced each visible landform, and then he would have made tea." Benjamin made a sound that was almost a laugh. "He sounds like he was good company." "He was the best company I have ever had," she said. Another pause. Then, carefully, "until recently, perhaps." She had not meant to say that. She looked at him and found him looking at her with an expression that was open in a way she had not seen him permit before, and the air between them shifted with the particular quality of a thing changing permanently. "I should get back to work," she said. "Letitia." She stopped. She had not heard her name said quite that way, with that particular weight, since her father had said it in his final hours. "Yes," she said. "I need to tell you something, and I want to tell it to you plainly because I think you are someone who deserves plain words." She turned to face him. He was sitting with his forearms on his knees, looking at her steadily. "I have been in this country for 9 years," he said. "I have met a great many people. Men and women who were brave, and some who were brilliant, and some who were both. I have never met anyone who combined the two the way you do. And I have been, since approximately the moment you laid that map on the clerk's desk, in a condition that I believe is best described as falling in love with you." The mountains were very quiet around them. The wind was gentle and smelled of pine and cold stone. "That is," said Letitia, somewhat carefully, "a great deal to say on an open ridgeline." "I know," said Benjamin. "I have been trying to find a better place, and I'm not convinced one exists. I am in the middle of a survey." "I know that too, and there are men from the CTLC who may still be in this area." "Also true." She looked at him for a long moment. He did not look away. "Benjamin," she said, "I am not a person who does things in half measures." "I know," he said again. "I would not be in love with you if you were." She felt something open in her chest that she had not realized was closed. It was not dramatic. It was the slow, enormous way that ground shifts after long winter, not violently but completely. "Let me finish the documentation for this point," she said, "and then I would like to continue this conversation." "I'll be here," said Benjamin. She turned back to her instruments and worked with great precision for the next 30 minutes, and she was aware the entire time that he was sitting quietly behind her, waiting with the patience of someone who understood that what she was doing was not a delay but a completion, and that understanding made something warm and permanent settle in the center of her. When she had finished and the instruments were secured and the notebook was safely in its oilskin wrapping, she turned around and he was exactly where she had left him, sitting on the flat rock with the evening light making gold out of everything around him. She walked over and sat down next to him, closer than before. "I have not," she said, "had a great deal of experience with this sort of thing, which is to say with people, romantically. I have been for most of my life more interested in the work than in the social configurations surrounding the work." "That seems entirely reasonable," said Benjamin. "But I have also been, since approximately the moment you stood up to Harlan Foss without turning it into a performance," she said, "increasingly aware that you are someone I would like to know better." "Considerably better," he looked at her. "How considerably?" She felt the warmth in her face again, and this time she did not try to redirect it. "Very considerably," she said. He reached out and took her hand. His hand was exactly as she had noticed it from the beginning, broad, careful, warm. She looked down at their joined hands and then up at him, and he was watching her with the particular steadiness that she had come to understand was not restraint but depth. "We should get off this ridgeline before dark," she said. "We absolutely should," he agreed, and he helped her to her feet, and he held her hand one moment longer than strictly necessary before releasing it to pick up the equipment. And that single unnecessary moment was, she thought, perfect. They came down from the high country the following morning and rode south toward Dusty Creek with the complete survey data, all 11 points confirmed, cross-verified, and documented according to the highest methodological standards available to the discipline in 1880. The ride down was different from the ride up, not because the country had changed, because something between them had shifted into a new configuration, and the space between them on the trail, which had been courteous and professionally respectful on the way up, was now charged with a warmth that they both felt and neither felt any need to pretend about. They talked during the long riding hours in the way that two people talk when they are genuinely interested in each other, and have discovered that the other person has interesting things to say. She told him about the life of moving from survey to survey, about learning to find home in the work itself when no fixed place provided it. He told her about 9 years as a deputy marshal in territory, where the law was newer than the violence, and every day required improvising justice from what was available. He told her about coming west from Virginia as a young man of 22, looking for something larger than what the end of the war had left, and finding it in the great honest difficulty of frontier country. She told him that she had, at various points in her life, applied to 3 different cartographic societies in the East and been declined membership on the basis of her sex. She had then, in each case, submitted a written analysis of the methodological errors in the society's most recent published survey work, and 2 of the 3 societies had, after some internal correspondence, quietly offered her associate membership, which she had declined on the grounds that associate was not full, and she was not interested in partial recognition. He laughed at this. It was a full, genuine laugh, the first time she had heard him laugh that fully, and she found it delightful in a way she was only slightly embarrassed by. "You sent them correction letters," he said. "I sent them detailed methodological critiques with supporting calculations," she said. If they chose to experience those as correction letters, that was their reading of them. "I think," said Benjamin, "that you may be the most formidable person I have ever met, and I include 2 Army generals and a federal circuit judge in that assessment." "You have very good judgment," said Letitia, and the way she said it made him laugh again, and that sound, ringing out over the pinyon-covered hillside in the clear autumn air, felt to her like something she wanted to hear for a very long time. They reached Dusty Creek in the early afternoon of the third day after leaving the high country, and the town looked exactly as they had left it, except that there were 3 additional horses tied outside the territorial surveying office with the particular quality of animal that expensive horses have, and Letitia recognized the CTLC's organizational thoroughness in the fact that they had gotten there first. "Harlan Foss moved fast," said Benjamin. "He would have sent riders ahead while he tried to delay us," said Letitia, studying the horses. "Standard tactic. He knows we have the survey data and he is trying to get something on record before we can file. What do we do?" She pulled the field notebook from her coat, the oilskin wrap, the original map now with its 2 final points marked and notated in her precise hand, and her father's surveying license. "We walk in," she said. The office was crowded. Foss was there with 2 men who had the polished look of lawyers from a larger city, and the round clerk was there looking more agitated than usual. And there was also, which was unexpected, a second territorial official who had apparently been summoned from the district land office. A thin, silver-haired man named Commissioner Aldous Prentice, who, according to the ornate desk plate propped in front of him, had authority over all land registration disputes in the territory. Foss saw Letitia come in and his expression did something complicated. He had expected her, she could tell, but possibly not quite yet. "Miss Ralston," said Commissioner Prentice, rising slightly in his chair. "I understand you have been conducting survey work in the high country north of the Mora River Valley." "I have completed it," said Letitia. She placed the field notebook, the map, and her father's license on the clerk's desk with the same deliberate precision she had used 11 days ago. "I am here to file the completed survey as the legally binding cartographic record for the Sangre de Cristo corridor, survey reference number 447R, originally licensed to Professor Gideon Ralston in 1869. "That survey," said Foss's lead lawyer, a narrow man with spectacles and a practiced smoothness, "has not been continuously registered. There is a question of legal continuity that would need to." "Section 14 of the Territorial Surveying Act of 1872, said Letitia, "explicitly provides for the completion and filing of a licensed survey by a certified apprentice in the event of the death of the primary licensee, provided that the apprentice's certification was established prior to the licensee's death, and that the completion methodology meets the same standards as the original work. My certification is documented in my father's licensing records, which you will find in the file. My methodology is documented in the field notebooks, which you will find comprehensive, and my mathematics are correct, which anyone with the relevant training can verify." She placed a third document on the desk, a 12-page mathematical summary of the entire survey, all 11 points, all cross-verification calculations, all azimuth angles and distance measurements, written in the clean, logical notation style that her father had developed and she had learned and improved upon. The room was quiet. Commissioner Prentice reached out and took the 12-page document. He looked at the first page, then he turned to the second. Then he set it down with the care of someone who recognizes they are handling something precise. "I would like to have a qualified surveyor review these calculations," he said. "Of course," said Letitia. "I welcome it. I believe you will find them accurate to within the margin of error produced by the instrument precision available, which is considerably narrower than the margin of error in the CTLC's previously filed coordinates for this region." Foss's lawyer started to speak. Benjamin moved to stand just slightly to one side of Letitia, a positioning that was not aggressive but was entirely clear, and the lawyer stopped. "Deputy Marshal Easton," said Commissioner Prentice, noting the badge. "You were present during this survey." "I was assigned security detail for the duration," said Benjamin. "I witnessed all 11 survey points being read, recorded, and verified according to the methods described in Miss Ralston's documentation. I would also like to submit a separate statement regarding an encounter with CTLC representatives, including Mr. Foss, on the ridgeline containing survey point P10, during which statements were made that I believe warrant review. He placed his own small notebook on the desk. Foss said, "Harlan," from somewhere behind his composed exterior, and his lawyer touched his arm and shook his head slightly. Commissioner Prentice looked at the assembled documents, the map, the notebooks, the mathematical summary, the deputy marshal's statement for a long moment. Then he said, "I will order a formal review. In the meantime, no further registrations will be processed for land coordinates in the Sangre de Cristo corridor until the review is complete. That applies to all parties." It was not a complete victory. Not yet. But it was the door properly opened. Outside the surveying office, in the thin afternoon light of a New Mexico October, Letitia stood on the boardwalk and allowed herself, for the first time since her father's death, to feel the forward-leaning relief of a thing that was no longer only hers to carry. Benjamin came out behind her and stood beside her, and they looked at the street together for a moment. "That was," he said, "extraordinarily well handled." "The calculations were correct," she said. "Everything else follows from that." "You are going to tell me it was simple." "I am going to tell you it was the work I was trained for," she said, "which is the same thing." He looked at her sideways with a particular expression, and she felt the warmth of it land in her chest. "What happens now?" he asked. "The review takes approximately 6 weeks. I will need to be available for questions and to verify the calculations in person. I cannot leave Dusty Creek until it is resolved." "I have jurisdiction in this district," said Benjamin. "I intend to monitor the review process closely, in an official capacity." "How very professionally convenient," she said, and she saw the edge of his mouth move. She took a room at the better of Dusty Creek's 2 boarding houses, a clean and decently managed establishment run by a widow named Mrs. Cecilia Drummond, who was approximately 60 years old, had survived 2 husbands and a flood, and ran her establishment with a combination of warmth and absolute standards that Letitia found genuinely comforting. She settled in with her father's instruments, her notebooks, and the careful organization of a woman who had been making temporary places into functional homes for most of her life. The 6 weeks that followed were, in the best possible sense, extraordinary. The formal survey review was conducted by a qualified territorial surveyor named Hargreaves, a precise and humorless man from the Santa Fe district office, who clearly expected to find something to dispute, and who spent 3 full days examining Letitia's calculations before sitting down across from her in the land office conference room and saying, with visible reluctance, that her methodology was not only correct but substantially more rigorous than anything currently in the territorial filing system. Commissioner Prentice, presented with this assessment, ordered a full comparison of the CTLC's filed coordinates against Letitia's verified survey. The comparison, which took another 10 days, confirmed her father's original finding. The CTLC's coordinates were systematically off by approximately 40 chains east of the actual topography, a consistent bias that, as Letitia had told Benjamin on the first day of their ride, was exactly the kind of error that placed 7 homesteader families at risk of illegal displacement. The legal consequences moved through the territorial system with a speed that surprised Letitia, though Benjamin told her it was less surprising given that Commissioner Prentice was a man who had seen what land fraud did to frontier communities and had a personal dislike of it that exceeded his tolerance for the CTLC's financial influence in the territory. Harlan Foss was not charged criminally, which was disappointing but not unexpected. The evidence of direct fraud was documented in the survey discrepancy, but proving intent in a territorial court in 1880 was a different order of difficulty. However, the CTLC's previously filed coordinates were invalidated, and the 7 homesteader families in the Mora Valley received official legal confirmation that their land claims were valid and properly documented. Letitia received a letter from one of those families, a couple named Hendrickson, who had been farming their valley section for 4 years, and had spent the last 18 months under the shadow of potential dispossession. The letter was simple and direct, and it made her cry, which was something she did alone in her room at Mrs. Drummond's, and then she washed her face and went downstairs to dinner. Benjamin was at dinner that evening. He had been at dinner most evenings, not in a presumptuous way, but in the way of a man who has found a place where he is welcome and is honest about the fact that it matters to him. He and Letitia had developed a rhythm over these weeks, the mornings when she worked on the final documentation and he attended to his other duties, the afternoons when they often rode together into the surrounding country, and the evenings at Mrs. Drummond's table, where the conversation ranged widely, and where Letitia sometimes looked across the table at Benjamin and found him already looking at her with the expression that meant he was thinking something that had not yet become words. He courted her, though that was perhaps too formal a word for what it was. He was attentive without being suffocating. He brought her things she actually needed: good lamp oil for her evening work, a leather binding tool when he noticed the spine of one of the field notebooks fraying, a small collection of wildflowers from the hillside east of town one afternoon that he placed on the table outside her room without ceremony or explanation, and which she kept in a tin cup of water on her writing desk until they were entirely past their prime. She allowed herself, gradually and deliberately, to lean into what was developing between them. This was its own kind of work. She was not accustomed to allowing someone in, not since her father, not since the long years of moving that had made sustained closeness feel like a risk with no reliable outcome. But Benjamin was patient with her in a way that did not feel like tolerance for a difficulty. It felt like genuine respect for the pace at which she moved toward things, which was usually carefully and always with her eyes open. There was an evening, about 3 weeks into her stay in Dusty Creek, when they were sitting on the front porch of Mrs. Drummond's establishment after dinner, in the cooling dark, and he said, "Where will you go after the review is complete?" She had been thinking about this. "I have been considering establishing a permanent surveying practice," she said. "There is significant work available in the territory, more than any competent surveyor could manage alone." "Alone," he said. "I am considering all variables," she said carefully. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "I have been in Dusty Creek for 4 years. I have thought on occasion about whether I would stay. I had not found a sufficient reason in either direction to decide." He paused. "That has changed recently." She looked at him. He was looking at the street, and the lamplight from the window beside them fell across his face at an angle that made everything about his expression clear. "Benjamin," she said, "I know it has not been long," he said. "I know you are not the kind of person who does things without thinking them through, and I know that your work matters to you in a way that should not be subordinated to anything else, including whatever this is between us. This," she said softly, "is something rather specific." He looked at her then. "Yes, it is." "I am thinking it through," she said. "I am not uncertain about what I am thinking." "What are you thinking?" She had rehearsed this privately, in the way she rehearsed complicated calculations, running through the components and verifying the conclusions. Now she said it plainly. "I am thinking that I have spent most of my life in movement and in work and in the company of my father, who was the best companion I can imagine, and who is gone. And I am thinking that I have found, unexpectedly and in the middle of a surveying crisis, a man who is genuinely interesting and genuinely good, and who has looked at the most demanding and specific parts of who I am and found them admirable rather than inconvenient." She paused. "I am thinking that that is rare, and that I would be foolish to treat it as less than it is." Benjamin was very still. "I am also thinking," she said, with a precision that was entirely characteristic, "that a surveying practice in New Mexico territory would benefit from a partner with excellent territorial knowledge, strong community relationships, and a legal background sufficient to navigate the kind of institutional obstruction that I have recently encountered professionally." The corner of his mouth moved. "That is a very specific analysis. I am a very specific person." He reached out and took her hand, as he had done on the ridgeline with the same careful warmth, and this time she turned her hand over and held his back. "Are you asking me something?" he said. "Not yet," she said. "I am establishing premises. The conclusion will follow." He laughed, that full and genuine laugh, and it rang out in the desert night, and Mrs. Drummond looked out her kitchen window and smiled and went back to her dishes. The survey was formally confirmed and filed in the territorial records on the 14th of November, 1880. Letitia stood in the land office and watched Commissioner Prentice apply the official stamp to the completed document, Survey Reference Number 447R, Sanger de Cristo Corridor, completed by Letitia Ann Ralston, Certified Apprentice, on behalf of the estate of Professor Gideon Ralston, primary licensee, and felt the particular completeness of a thing that has been done well and entirely. Benjamin was standing beside her, and he put his hand at the small of her back, very briefly, as Prentice stamped the document, and she leaned into it for just a moment. Afterward, they walked out into a November afternoon that was cold and bright and smelled of wood smoke and winter coming, and Letitia felt the particular freedom of a person who has carried something heavy for a long time and set it down properly. "It is done," she said. "It is done," he agreed. She turned to face him on the boardwalk of Dusty Creek's Main Street, with the mountains visible to the north and the sound of the town around them and the light making everything clear and honest. "Benjamin," she said, "yes, I have established sufficient premises." He looked at her with an expression that was deep and warm and entirely sure. "Have you?" "I would like to stay in Dusty Creek," she said. "I would like to establish the surveying practice I mentioned, and I would like to do it with you, in whatever configuration you think is appropriate to propose, which I expect you have been considering." He was quiet for exactly 1 moment. Then he said, "I have been considering it for approximately 6 weeks." "Then by all means," she said, "proceed." He took her hands in both of his, and he looked at her with the full and steady depth of a man who is absolutely certain, and he said, "Letitia Ralston, I am asking you to marry me, to be my partner in the practice, in the territory, and in everything else. To let me spend the rest of my life being the person who watches you do the most extraordinary things I have ever seen and gets to hand you the lamp oil afterward." She felt tears at the back of her eyes, which she did not entirely prevent and which she did not entirely mind. "Yes," she said. "Yes, Benjamin, I will." He pulled her close and kissed her there on the boardwalk of Dusty Creek's Main Street in the clear November light, and Mrs. Drummond's neighbor, Mrs. Alcott, who happened to be passing, stopped and said, "Well, it's about time," and walked on. They were married in December of 1880 in a simple ceremony at the small adobe church at the west end of Dusty Creek. The minister was a practical man who kept the ceremony mercifully brief, and the witnesses were Mrs. Cecilia Drummond and a young deputy who worked with Benjamin, and the 7 Hendrickson family members drove 2 days from the Mora Valley to attend, which was the thing that made Letitia lose her careful composure and spend a moment with her face pressed to Benjamin's shoulder, which was broad enough for the purpose. After the ceremony, Mr. Hendrickson gave them a bottle of good whiskey, which Benjamin accepted with genuine gratitude, and Mrs. Hendrickson pressed Letitia's hands between both of hers and said, "Your father would have been very proud," and Letitia said, "I know," and believed it completely. The surveying practice that Letitia established in Dusty Creek in the spring of 1881, formally titled Ralston and Easton Territorial Survey, became within 2 years the most respected cartographic firm operating in New Mexico Territory. Letitia's methodological standards, applied consistently and without compromise, established a reputation for accuracy that made the practice the first choice for any survey work where the stakes were high enough that the numbers had to be absolutely right. Benjamin managed the legal and logistical dimensions with the same competence and integrity he brought to everything, and his network of territorial contacts and his ability to navigate the complex institutional landscape of frontier land management made the practice functional in ways that pure technical expertise alone could not have achieved. They worked together every day with the particular ease of two people whose strengths are genuinely complementary, who trust each other's judgment in their respective domains, and who like each other in the daily, granular, specific way that is different from falling in love and equally essential. Benjamin learned enough cartographic theory to be a genuinely useful field assistant, and he could, by the second year of the practice, set up the theodolite and take a preliminary reading to within a degree of Letitia's verification. She told him it was not impressive, and he said it was absolutely both, and she rolled her eyes in a way that meant she was pleased. Their home was a solid adobe house on the east side of Dusty Creek that they built, much of it with their own hands, over the course of 1881. It had a study with a dedicated drafting table for Letitia's map work, and a library wall that they began filling with the methodical acquisitiveness of two people who understood that good references were irreplaceable. It had a long front porch that faced west, toward the mountains, where they sat most evenings in the weather that permitted it. In the spring of 1882, Letitia filed a separate report with the Territorial Justice Office detailing the specific evidence she had assembled, along with Benjamin's field statement and the Commissioner's comparative survey analysis regarding the CTLC's methods. The report was thorough enough, and the evidence organized carefully enough that it prompted a federal inquiry, which took over a year to complete, and which ultimately resulted in the Consolidated Territorial Land Company being formally censured by the Federal Land Office and barred from filing survey work in New Mexico Territory without independent third-party verification. Harlan Foss left the territory in 1882. Where he went was not Letitia's concern, and she did not spend energy on it. In the autumn of 1882, a federal investigator reviewing the records related to her father's death, a review that Benjamin had quietly continued to support, and that had been triggered in part by the CTLC inquiry, found the Santa Fe camp helper, whose name was Thomas Beaumont, now living in Colorado. Under questioning, Beaumont admitted that he had been paid by a CTLC associate to provide inaccurate information to the attending physician regarding the circumstances of Gideon Ralston's death, and that what he had witnessed was not a natural heart seizure, but a sudden collapse following an argument with two men he identified as CTLC agents who had come to the camp, demanding that Ralston surrender his survey data. The exact cause of her father's death could not, at that late remove, be medically confirmed as anything other than what had been originally documented, but the investigators' report concluded that Gideon Ralston had been subjected to significant physical intimidation by company agents immediately prior to his death, and that the camp helper's original statement had been materially false. The men identified could not be prosecuted. The evidence was old, and the chain of direct responsibility was legally insufficient. This was painful, and Letitia allowed herself to feel the pain of it properly, which Benjamin was there for in the way he was there for all the important things, present, steady, not trying to fix what couldn't be fixed, simply there. He knew the risks, she said, one evening in their kitchen with the stove burning warm against the October cold. He went back to the high country every year knowing what the CTLC was doing. He knew they were capable of violence. He went anyway, said Benjamin. Because the map mattered, she said. Because the honest record of that land mattered. Because 7 families and however many others deserved to have the ground under their feet be truly known. He was right, said Benjamin. He was, she said, and now it is known, because of what he started and what I finished. And whatever they did to him, they could not make the land unknown again. The survey is filed. It is permanent. She said this with the force of someone who needs a thing to be true and has made it true through work, and it was true, and Benjamin looked at her across their kitchen with everything he felt for her clear in his face. She crossed the room and he wrapped his arms around her, and they stood like that in the warm kitchen with the sound of the October wind outside, and she let herself be held by him completely, which was something she did now without the old effort it had once required, because he had never given her a reason to resist it. In early 1883, their son was born. They named him Gideon Benjamin Easton, and he arrived in the world with the specific and forceful presence of someone who has no intention of going unnoticed. And Letitia looked at him in the first moments with the particular awe of encountering something genuinely new, and thought that her father's name would be carried by a person who might someday be as interested in the land as the man he was named for. Benjamin held his son with an expression that Letitia archived carefully in her memory, because she had never seen his face quite that open before, and it was remarkable to look at. Mrs. Drummond came to help in those first weeks, with the competence and warmth that were her consistent qualities, and the house on the east side of Dusty Creek was full of the particular busyness of a new life being accommodated. The surveying practice continued. Letitia returned to field work when Gideon was 8 weeks old, taking him with her in the first short survey trips in the manner of a woman who had spent her own childhood in the field and saw no reason why her child should not do the same. Benjamin sometimes accompanied her and sometimes stayed in Dusty Creek managing the office work, and they had hired a young woman named Clara by then, a former schoolteacher's daughter who had mathematical ability that Letitia recognized and was actively training, because she believed firmly that every capable person deserved proper instruction, and that the work was better when more skilled people were doing it. By 1884, the practice had 3 clients in different parts of the territory at any given time, and had completed survey work for homesteaders, small mining operations, and the territorial government itself, on a railroad route assessment that Letitia accepted with specific contractual protections, ensuring that her survey would not be used to support displacement of existing residents. Benjamin had resigned his deputy marshal position in 1882, which was a decision they made together over a long conversation that ranged across 2 evenings. He did not stop being who he was in relation to the law and the community. He remained deeply embedded in Dusty Creek and its surrounding area as a person of integrity whose judgment was respected. But the surveying practice needed him fully, and he was fully available to give it. He still wore his old deputy's hat. She never asked him to change that. In the spring of 1885, Letitia completed the formal publication of her father's survey methodology, which she had been compiling from his notebooks and her own refinements for several years. It was published as a monograph by a university press in St. Louis and was dedicated to Letitia Ralston, cartographer, teacher, and honest witness to the land. She sent a copy to each of the 3 cartographic societies that had declined to offer her full membership, with a brief note and no additional comment. One society wrote back within a month to offer full membership without qualifier. She accepted that one. Benjamin read the monograph in its entirety and told her it was the best document he had ever read on any subject, which she knew was not strictly true, and which she knew he completely meant. Their second child, a daughter they named Wren Cecilia Easton, arrived in 1886. She was small and bright-eyed, and from the very beginning had the quality of watching everything with assessment rather than passivity, and Letitia recognized the look and felt a particular delight at it. Gideon, who was 3 by then, accepted his sister with the philosophical equanimity of a child who has been raised in a house where new things are treated as worthy of attention rather than alarm, and Benjamin spent an entire Sunday afternoon watching his 2 children arrange a collection of small stones into patterns with a seriousness that made him look across the room at Letitia with an expression that contained everything. She put down her drafting pen and crossed the room and sat beside him, and they both watched the children arrange their stones. "You know what he is doing," she said, watching Gideon. "I have been wondering. He is sorting by color and then by size within each color group. He has been doing it consistently for the last 20 minutes. Benjamin watched. Gideon continued his patient work. Wren watched her brother and then began adding stones to his groupings in a way that seemed random but was, Letitia noticed, adding the irregular shapes to each group rather than the regular ones, creating a consistent secondary sort. "She is sorting by shape within his color and size groups," said Letitia with quiet astonishment. "She is 9 months old," said Benjamin. "Babies notice patterns," said Letitia. "They are designed to notice patterns. We just tend not to give them sufficient credit." He put his arm around her shoulder and she leaned into him, watching their children sort stones on the floor of their house with the calm and focused attention of little scientists. "Are you happy?" he asked. It was a question he asked occasionally, not from insecurity but from genuine wanting to know. The first time he had asked it, in the first year of their marriage, she had answered it with more precision than was probably necessary, outlining the components of her satisfaction and their relative weights. He had listened to the whole answer with his full attention and then said, "So yes," and she had said, "Yes," and he had smiled. Now she said simply and completely, "Exceptionally." He pressed his lips to her hair. Outside, the New Mexico evening was arranging itself in its customary spectacular fashion, the sky moving through golds and pinks, and then the deep clear blue of dusk, the mountains holding the last light on their upper faces, the piñon-covered hillsides going dark in waves from east to west. The smell of the desert in spring came through the open window, that clean and irreplaceable smell of sage and stone, and something that had no name but was simply the smell of this particular piece of the earth being itself. Letitia thought about her father. She thought about the map, rolled now in its archival oilskin in the study, both a working document and a memorial. She thought about the 11 survey points, each one a coordinate in space, and also a point in the longer story of this land being honestly known. She thought about the cold ridgeline where she had done the calculation that Benjamin had called extraordinary, and about the moment after, when she had sat on the flat rock and he had sat beside her, and something had shifted between them into its permanent configuration. She thought about how she had not been looking for any of this, had been looking only for the next survey point, the next coordinate, the completion of her father's work, and how the map had led her here to this house, to this man, to these children sorting stones on the floor, to this life that was both the fulfillment of what she had been trained for and something entirely beyond what she had trained for. Her father had said that a map is a letter written to someone who hasn't visited yet. She thought he might have meant more by that than cartography. She thought about him finishing his 11 years of work in his last hours, speaking not about his own legacy or his own pain, but about the map, about the land, about the importance of finishing the honest record. She thought about how that had felt at the time like loss and now also felt like gift, the kind of gift that keeps reshaping itself over the years into something you could not have understood when you received it. She reached out and covered Benjamin's hand with hers, where it rested on the arm of the chair beside her. He turned his hand over and held hers back, the same gesture he had made on the ridgeline in the last light of an October afternoon, and the rightness of it was exactly what it had always been. Solid, warm, and permanent, like a coordinate confirmed by 3 independent readings, like a survey point that will not move regardless of what anyone does to the rock around it. Gideon finished sorting his stones and looked up at his parents with Letitia's clear eyes and Benjamin's steady expression, and said something that was not quite a word yet, but was clearly a statement of some considerable satisfaction. Wren patted the completed stone arrangement with one small, purposeful hand. Outside, the first stars appeared over the Sangre de Cristo range. The map was done. The house was real. The work continued and would continue, in hands she was training and in this man beside her and in these children who were already, in their wordless and specific way, beginning to notice the patterns of the world around them with the seriousness it deserved. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was everything. And somewhere north of the Mora River Valley, on a limestone ledge where a woman had once set a theodolite in the last afternoon light, and found a point that should not have been findable and written the coordinates in a dead man's notebook with a living woman's hand. The mountains continued to be exactly what they were: large, honest, and enduring, standing in the clear New Mexico air, precisely where the survey said they would be.